so obviously get home before it gets too dark. So a couple of topics today, and first one is on Brexit, which most people think, well, how is it relevant to Australia, because we're obviously a long way from Britain and we haven't had very close trade links for a while. So we'll just talk about whether that's going to make any difference to Australia, because one of the concepts I think that the British have, one of the reasons the British voted to leave the European community is they really want to sort of rediscover the old Commonwealth and all those the good old days when they had an empire and the sun never set and all that sort of stuff. I think that's part of the reason, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But just another topical issue is, of course, North Korea and where they're going to blow up the place. But if you read the articles in depth, the foreign affairs people are saying that all the propaganda that the North Koreans are putting out is only really for the propaganda to maintain that regime. We know it's a very authoritarian regime. We know that it's run by a dictator, and it's now the grandson running the dictatorship. So a lot of this stuff is just for really domestic consumption inside North Korea, but also it makes North Korea feel like that they're standing up to bullies, because they see the Americans as a bully. They've obviously had this major nuclear armaments program to make sure that they feel that they're protected, because they feel that they're being attacked by either South Korea or America and the rest of the world. So the more that the Americans push this idea that they're doing the wrong thing, the more they're saying, well, we're the underdog. So a lot of this stuff will go to and fro, but basically China wants to keep North Korea going because that's a buffer between South Korea and China. They don't really want the South Koreans to be on their border, so they want North Korea to stay. They'll only do enough to just keep the world happy. China could make North Korea collapse in probably 6 months by just cutting off oil, because they're the only country that really trades with them, because every other country is not trading with North Korea. But they won't do that. They'll probably they've stopped imports of coal into North Korea, and they can do a whole range of things, but they could make North Korean economy collapse, but the Chinese are not interested in that. So they'll make sort of all these noises. There's going to be lots of noise around, but don't panic. Nobody's going to pull the trigger inadvertently anyway. It's only if some accident happens. But I just thought I'd give you that bit of perspective, because what you get in the newspapers is the world's ready to fire a missile, it's all going to blow up. The North Koreans have got extensive bunker systems at the border. Even with, the Americans just developed a huge bomb which could bust bunkers. They're not going to be able to, the whole North Korean border is just one mass of bunkers that the North Koreans could hide under. If North Korea wanted to attack South Korea, Seoul is only within artillery distance from the North Korean border. They estimate something like 30,000 casualties in Seoul alone within 30 minutes. It's because of just artillery fire would go into the Seoul capital. So there's not going to be winners and all that. So it's what they call MAD, mutually assured destruction. Nobody's going to go, pull the trigger by choice. It's only if somebody starts a fire incorrectly at each other, and then it all escalates. But anyway, I don't think that's going to happen. So they've been at loggerheads ever since the Korean War. The Korean War actually hasn't finished yet. It's only been a truce since they had a truce that created the 49th parallel. So they're actually still at war technically. So you can't actually have a war if you're still at war, if you take that logic. Anyway, not to worry about that one too much. Anyway, let's talk about Brexit, because you hear a lot about Brexit in the last 6 months, 9 months. Britain decided to leave the European community, and we had a vote with roughly 52% of people deciding they wanted to leave, and 72% of the people only voted though. But the people who voted were generally the people over 50. A lot of younger people didn't really bother voting, probably because they were going to work, or probably because they thought, oh, well, why should we worry, because somebody else will keep the country in the European community. And they generally, people under under 50 were pro-European and people over 50 were anti-European. The European, so then David Cameron resigned, eventually Theresa May became the Prime Minister, and the whole concept was you can trigger an exit from the European community, but you're only given 2 years to do it. And the big problem is that it's a very complex process once you've been integrated, partly integrated, to do that. But the main thing is that originally Britain didn't join the European community, they didn't join the EEC, they actually joined the European Economic Community. So that was a community of a free trade community. So the progress has actually been over since 1973 from an economic community to a political union, and that's where a lot of people in Britain have really become annoyed with the European concept, because they really have been, if you think about it, they've been a separate country with borders, water borders for 1,000 years of, since 1066 with the current, monarchy goes back to 1066. You really got a country which is very independent of Europe and thinks that way in a lot of ways, where Europeans haven't. So that's sort of one of the reasons and backdrops to it, that the free trade zone turned into from an economic zone into a union, and the Britain turned its back on what we used to know as the Commonwealth, which was the countries we know of, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and became trading with the Europeans. And of course, if you go back to the times of the Commonwealth, we used to have a lot of exports to the UK, and Britain was a major trading country over, not just over the last couple of hundred years, but you can go back to the 1500s, the 1600s, the East India Empire, East India Company. In India, they were trading cotton, tea and spices back to the UK. And then what the UK was exporting back into India was manufactured goods like cotton, metal products, things like railways, all the paraphernalia of the modern world. We were sending across lamb and wool, beef. In the Americas, we're providing tobacco, wheat, beef, and then China was tea, porcelain, and silk. So this trading culture has been around in Britain for a long, long time. We forget that that's really where a lot of the wealth of Britain came from, and even to the point where they were trading opium from India to China. There was 2 opium wars in China about that. They slaves from West Africa to Caribbean, made a lot of money out of that, and some of the old English aristocracy have got their heritages from the fact that they used to trade slaves. And the manufactured part of England was tobacco. Bristol was a big tobacco manufacturing place. London was banking, insurance, shipbuilding. Liverpool and Manchester, textiles, weaving and spinning and cotton, we call Manchester, which is all that bed linen, came from the name Manchester. The thing about weaving cotton was that the north of England was a great place to weave cotton. It was damp and moist and cool. You actually, when you spin cotton in an environment like that, it actually produces better cloth. The Indians didn't have the same. In India, they used to produce a lot of their own cloth, but it was produced in the villages. They would spin the yarn, make their cloth inside the village. But when the British came along with their better technologies, they actually put all these people, spinners and weavers, in the villages out of jobs. And one of the reasons why I used to call India the jewel of the empire was because you had this two-way process of taking cloth from India, or cotton from India, weaving it and sending it back again. And that was just one part of the process of taking materials from the colonies and taking them back and making them a two-way process. And of course we had shipbuilding, and we remember the 3 major ships that was built in Belfast, which was the Titanic. There was 2 others. Glasgow, Liverpool, big shipbuilding centres. And of course shipbuilding was crucial to a trading country like Britain. If you didn't have good shipbuilding, you didn't have a good trading system. So a lot of this trade was really how England developed into a wealthy country and kept England ahead of the pack. And as far as the British Empire was concerned, it was crucial that you had the trade, because that created the wealth inside Britain, but also inside the colonies. British companies provided the first capital for all our banks in Australia, for instance. So, you know, British insurance companies were the first insurance companies that developed in Australia. So a lot of it, you can go back to a lot of our insurance companies used to be British companies. And we also brought our legal system, we brought out the concepts of trade and our concepts of law all came from Britain. So the only problem was that the two world wars really stopped a lot of the trade, and that was a real turning point in the British economy, because once they lost not only the shipping, because a lot of shipping got destroyed in the blockade, but it also destroyed the reasons for the trade, and that was because the colonies started to say, well, we can produce our own manufactured goods. As a consequence, after First World War and Second World War, a lot of manufacturing came back into Australia and Canada and New Zealand because there was no trade in those goods during the wars, and we had to produce our own. So Britain lost a lot of their trade benefits by those two wars. They also got terribly into debt to finance those wars. So the two world wars really changed Britain from being the world power into a middle-ranking power. So then Britain went into the European community. Really it was the right thing to do, because obviously the amount of trade that was going with the colonies was declining. And on their borders, 21 miles away, was this huge continent with 250, 300 million people to sell products to. And so you didn't need to go off to the colonies to sell it. You can just sell their products back into Europe. And so now in the European communities, 350 million people, if you take off Britain, which is about 60 million, that's about 290. That's 290 million people to sell things to. And the benefit of the free trade that's evolved in the European communities is that you've got all these countries specialising in what they're good at. The Britain basically specialised in legal services, banking and insurance. A lot of their heavy industries like shipbuilding, textiles, clothing, footwear, steel making, they lost all that because they became uncompetitive. But Australia lost its markets too, because we used to still, even though we lost the amount of trade declined with Britain, we still were sending a lot of things like our beef and our lamb. Tasmania was sending apples and pears to the UK. Wool and sugar were all going to Britain because that was our traditional trading partners, and we were getting a lot of they were getting benefit of our cheap products. We had good quality products, but now that turned into getting their materials from Europe. So they were getting things from Greece and Turkey. They were getting agricultural products from all those countries rather than coming to a place like Australia. And we've turned our back on England too by also starting to, instead of importing things that they manufactured, like Britain used to produce a lot of cars. Well, they produce cars now, but not to the same extent. But now we've turned our back and got cars from Japan and South Korea, and even German cars are more popular than British car, obviously, these days. Also, we used to get our clothing from Japan. After the Second World War, a lot of clothing came out of Japan, where they used to buy our wool, they used to manufacture it, we'd buy it back, and now that comes from China. Also, our electronics now come from Japan and Taiwan, China. So we don't have that trade relationship anymore with the UK because they're not great in electronics, they're not great in car manufacture. So we've now really gone and diversified our markets away from the UK and into other parts of the continent, around the world, sorry. So anyway, reasons why they left. Well, because they felt that they were an island, and they've always felt that there was one united people. History of running a colonial empire, that's what they're sort of harking back to. I think that they think, oh, well, we can just reignite the old colonial ways and they could be the running of that. And that's because a lot of the people over 50 still felt that nostalgia for that grandness, that having that, I suppose, having that feeling that they were running the world, the sun never set on the empire. Control over their own government, and that's probably the big one, was that because the European community imposed lots of laws, and there was things running around at the time of the European vote, the Brexit vote, saying that they would have to have straight bananas from then on. There's all sorts of crazy things. They'd have to have litre milk rather than a pint. You know, there's all these sort of things that were put up to people saying that the Europeans were dominating England. They were telling people what to do in England, and they wanted their independence back. Another one was the movement of lots of people from the poorer countries of Europe. So you've got people from Spain and Poland in particular coming to England for work, and taking up a lot of the low-class jobs. And that's because the British didn't want to do them, but that's another story. But they just didn't like people coming in to Europe, into Britain. But Britain's had a lot of migrations over many centuries. I mean, the Huguenots, which were the French Huguenots, came and sought refuge in England. At one stage, they were Protestants, French Protestants. You've had Jewish people come into Britain to get sanctuary. You've had, over time, you've had lots of migrations into Europe. You can even go back to the Angles and Saxons, who didn't quite necessarily be invited in there, but they came in from a place like Denmark and Holland. They came and invaded and went into Europe. So Britain's always been invaded by different parts of Europe. So having new migrations in Europe is not new. And a lot of regions of Britain didn't have direct contact with Europe. There's really only London, which was a service centre through banking, insurance and finance, that had a lot of trade with Europe. A lot of the law firms in Britain were providing a lot of the legal services. A lot of the banks were providing finance, and a lot of the insurance companies like your Lloyd's of London were providing a lot of the insurances through Europe for a lot of the businesses. They've had a lot of tradition in that because they've been a great trading country for many centuries. So it's not unusual to think they'll be good at that. But secondly, the Europeans were using their services in the service industry. And the other one was really the Port of Hull and probably London was where you had direct contact with Europe and in their trading services. So they didn't have a lot of countries, a lot of counties in Britain didn't have a lot of contact with Europe. So what's happened is that the pound's gone down. They realised that initially that this is not going to be a good result economically for them. The pound went down, and they fell against both the US dollar and the euro. But unemployment stayed low because what's happened is the currencies fell, and that gave Britain a bit of a leg up as far as exports. If you drop the currency, you can sell things at a cheaper price overseas. And because they were still in the European community, they could still sell a lot more products initially. But it's now starting to come home that once this unravels, they won't get easy access into the European markets. 290 million people right in the doorstep. They're going to have lots of tariff barriers. They're going to face lots of restrictions on their service industries, and a lot of what happened is a lot of service industries like insurance and banking will move into Europe itself. So those jobs will go. So the interesting thing was a lot of people didn't really know what they were voting about. What does it mean to leave the European community? All these were showing up on the Google Trends that people were saying, "Oh, we're voted to leave. What does that mean?" They hadn't really thought all this through, which is a bit sad that people couldn't really understand the impacts. And this is a lot of people wanted to leave England and move to Gibraltar because that's still part of Britain. I'm not sure why they want to go to Gibraltar, but it's primarily because if you went to Spain or Portugal, you might not have citizenship rights in the European community. So if you go to Gibraltar, you could still sit in the sun and drink coffee and still be part of Britain, and eat pork pies or something. Anyway, so really what's going to happen is potentially going to be custom checks and barriers for goods coming into to the European community, longer border checks. Props for Australians, we won't be called aliens anymore, because you probably, when you get off at Heathrow, you have to go to the aliens line. Maybe we'll be called the colonials or something, I don't know. But yeah, potentially they're going to have Europeans at some sort of checkpoint where the Europeans have had some checks on entry into Britain. And people, the Brits living over in the European, there's a whole issue about what rights do they have? Do they get European citizenship, or do they have to go back to the UK? What sort of visas will they get? You know, sort of the whole range of issues there. So basically, what's left is that Britain's very much a service industries, their strengths. Manufacturing is not their strengths anymore. They've only really got they've still got a manufacturing and car manufacturing industry, but they'll face tariff barriers to get their cars into Europe. So Nissan's thinking that they'll move onto the continent somewhere. They're up in I think Sheffield or in the Midlands there. You've got Jaguar, you've got a few other car manufacturers which are English, but they Rolls-Royce is owned by BMW these days, and Mini. So whether they move their factories to Germany or something like that, you know, you could lose those sort of manufacturers. The main industry they're still pretty good at is defence industries. That's mainly British owned, so that may not change. And you've got higher value added there. It's not a low value added industry. But once they start to lose their car manufacturing industry, then it knocks on to components, you know, from tyres to dashboards to seats. All those things would knock on into the British economy, and that's where a lot of their manufacturing is still centred around that car industry. So potentially what will happen is the banking and insurance will go into the UK, from the UK to Europe. They're basically saying Paris or Frankfurt. Legal services probably to Dublin, because it's still part of the European community. And they'll either have two things. They'll either they won't probably completely close their banking operations in London, but they'll have major offices in these other countries, so that they can still do their work. And that may mean people have to leave London and work in Paris or Frankfurt, take their families with them, move over there to keep their jobs, or move to Dublin as another option. So the key thing that's now evolved is that the British can't actually get a free trade agreement with any other country until they actually leave the EU. They're not allowed to create free trade. So the option is, if you're not trading with the European community, what do? You go have some other trade options, and that would be to come to Australia or the United States or all these other countries as in a free trade agreement. But the problem with that, you can't do any negotiation in 2019, and it takes you 2 to 3, 5 years sometimes to actually create a free trade agreement. So what we're saying here is they've really backed themselves in a corner. They can't do anything until they're actually got out of the EU, and then when they do get out, they're going to have a time lag before they can get free trade agreements going. And we really, and the key thing is, we're actually doing a free trade agreement with the European community currently, and we'd rather have the option of a free trade agreement with 290 million people rather than 60 million people. So we're going to put that as our first priority in getting a free trade agreement there. The other thing is that the Americans, as you probably know, have got a president who has this concept of America first, and he doesn't really believe in free trade. So if they want to have a free trade agreement with Americans, they're going to be pushing a difficult road, because the Americans got a fairly free trade situation anyway, so there's not going to be much benefit in a free trade agreement with America anyway, and they're going to resist any free trade agreement as a general principle. But you know, if you go back to India and Australia and New Zealand to have all these new free trade agreements, it's a massive task, because as I said, each country has their own special industries they want to protect, and creating free trade agreements is very difficult. So another problem is, then you've got 44 years of agreements, subsidies, loans. A lot of EU loans went into Britain into undeveloped areas up in the north. Citizenship rights have got to be sorted out. Institutional arrangements, because the European community has, just the European Monetary Union, you've got to unwind all those things. It's just a massive task, and there's been a certain amount of information coming out that they had only discussions last week. The British came in and said we want to do all these things, and the British and the Europeans turned around and said, well, first of all, before you do anything, pay up your cost of leaving the European community, which is something like $100-something billion. Because they say, well, we don't want to really talk to you until you come up with the money. So that's going to be a big sticking point, is the money. And the second one is that you've got all these people who live in the Europeans who live in Britain now. They have been giving, Theresa May has said that she will give them citizenship or give them rights there, but it will be, it's going to be unwinding this year. There's 3 million EU citizens in Britain, but they'll presumably given some sort of visa to stay there. And what about European parliamentary laws? Do they stay? Because you see, you can have what's called a soft Brexit, where you keep the parliamentary laws, still allow migration but limited, and then still be part of being able to trade there. And that's probably the only way they're going to get out of this, is that they're going to have a partial exit but not a full exit. So yes, as I said, we can't do any trade agreements with them until 2019. We've really got a lot of our exports are now in other countries. So when Britain chopped us once Britain went into the EU, we then had very high tariff barriers on all our agricultural products, particularly. And the reason they have high agricultural tariff was because a lot of the poorer countries like Spain, Portugal, southern Italy and Greece produced a lot of that stuff that we were producing, the beef, the lamb, the vegetables, the fruits, and they wanted to stop that sort of that trade coming in. And so we lost a lot of our markets in that time from 73 onwards, because we just couldn't compete once the tariff was put on. So the key thing is that now we're actually exporting those sort of products to the Middle East for lamb, beef into Japan and South Korea. We export a lot of the wool to China because they've got the clothing manufacturer there. The only thing that really we could probably get is our resources, which are coal and gas, which they're the sort of areas that we could probably export back into the UK, because they want to diversify away from Russian gas and German atomic power, because Germany's going to close all its atomic power stations over the next 5 years or 10 years. So they have a need for energy, and they would like to diversify their sources of supply. So we probably have an option there, but it's not going to go to Britain mainly, it's going to go to Europe. That's where the big market is. And we won't probably have a free trade agreement with Britain anyway, so we'll probably push through a free trade agreement with Europe so we can start to export those things into Europe. And we won't really be going back to agricultural products in Europe, because there's plenty of agriculture producers in Europe that can produce it cheaply, and they obviously don't have the transport costs to produce export the goods internally in their own countries around Europe. So we're probably going to be better off doing a free trade agreement with Europe, and UK is going to be the second option, and that's long term. They're going to be basically the last one to be talked to. And in the meantime, they're caught where they've got no free trade agreement. So that's sort of the basic story there. With Britain has really backed itself into a corner, and the real thing what you'll see evolving is probably that the British will have to backtrack a lot, because they've got to either come up with the money or eventually capitulate and say, well, we will do a very soft exit and we'll try and still keep part of the European Union. But I think that Theresa May is probably under a lot of pressure because she wants a very hard line on this. And there's now lots of groups, including the British industry, like a lot of the people in Britain who are British industry are pushing to have a soft exit or no exit at all and try and change that. So we'll see what happens, but the key thing is that the evolution of British wealth has really been developed over centuries from trade. And if they don't have trade, their country's really going to be much poorer, and it will probably mean their currency will collapse over the next few years. Might be a good time to travel there, but that's probably that's probably what the real essence is. They will cut themselves out of markets in Europe because 44% of the trade goes to Europe, and the second thing is that they're not going to be able to replace it very easily. So that's a bit about the situation in Europe, but it's not going to be able to turn the clock back very easily.
Russell,
yeah.
You mentioned on your slide that it's likely that legislation will stay in Europe, legislation for England, from the UK.
Yeah, they'll probably have to, they can repeal it,
Yeah.
like all the legislation on British legislation can be repealed.
The perception we got last year was that certainly in England, the community want to have total control over their own legislation. So,
yeah.
you know, I was a little surprised to see that as listed as a possible likely outcome.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the fallback, is that they're going to say, well, the Europeans don't want to make it easy because they don't want other countries to leave. And there was in the last French election, as you probably know, the far right were pushing the idea of exiting Europe. Because you've got to remember that Germany and France were the core of the start of the European community, and they did that after the Second World War, primarily because they wanted to stop another war. They had two already, and they wanted to maintain economic relations so that you didn't have the emphasis towards war. So France leaving the European community would have been a complete disaster. Obviously, the French didn't decide they didn't want to go that way. And then the same thing happened in Denmark, and I think Denmark was another election where they didn't get populist votes up to leave the European community. But yes, Britain has always been independent in that sense. It's been an island by itself, and I think that's one of the things that they really feel that the Europeans are telling them what to do. You've got to remember, a lot of European countries are either very new, because Germany was created under Bismarck in 1860. Italy was only created under Garibaldi. They're very new countries, really, when you think about it. So Europe has also been a moving map of boundaries. So if you look at Alsace-Lorraine, sometimes you're in Germany and the next day it could be in France. Well, it just depends on where the borders are drawn on that day, you know. So they're used to having lots of change in their national boundaries and lots of change in government. So whereas Britain's had that boundary, and it's been pretty much, well, it hasn't changed because the oceans haven't changed. So I think that historical thing that have been very much having an empire which is spread around the world, they didn't look at Europe. They didn't see Europe only as competitors, really, because when the great race for empire was on in the 17th, 18th century, they were competing against France for carving up the world, against Germany, against Spain, and that competition meant they didn't really like the Europeans because they were trying to get big slabs of the globe that they were after anyway. You know, so, because it was both India and Canada could have been French. There's only two battles that changed all that. One in Quebec, which James Cook was involved with, and one at the time it was British East India Company. So both of those continents could have been French, but they turned to be British just because of two major battles. So that was the race on to carve up the world. So the British have always seen the Europeans as competitors rather than being part of a community. You know? And so that's part of the psyche, I think, too. You know?
Russell, what do you think is going to happen? Because the Irish heir and the Scots are both very pro-Europe.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because I think the Scots are going to have a referendum on it as well, but that hasn't got up yet. So, as far as they're concerned, they're still part of UK, and so I suppose.
Well, it mightn't be a United Kingdom.
Yeah, that might be ununited.
Because it's in their interest
Yeah.
to stay in Europe.
Well, that's right. The Scots get more benefit out of Europe than the British do. So
they've already had two referendums of separation.
that's right.
Which just went.
That's right. But that's right. I mean, they've wanted to separate. They've got this sort of own parliament, as you know. They don't have their own defence force or anything, but they have control over their own domestic affairs. I mean, as you know, England itself is one of the reasons why they want to leave is because they're saying, well, there's only two countries putting more money into the European community than taking out, and that's Germany and England. And they're saying, well, you know what, we won the war, so how come we're paying all this money to the Europeans? You know, so they.
Have you ever seen the film The Mouse That Roared? It's mythical. They declared war on America. It surrendered, so they now had to be looked after by you.
Oh, okay.
It was a movie.
Oh, okay. So, sure.
Yeah, just on another front, if you think hypothetically if that was held again, remembering only 72% turnout because it wasn't compulsory voting, could it possibly go the other way? Because the tip before it went forward was 52% would stay in Europe, 48 would exit Europe.
It's exit, yeah. That's
and it went the other way.
Well, it's just, and it's really that the problem is that you don't have compulsory voting over there. It's just,
no.
So
well, there might be a few people, if they ever put it to the vote again, that's hypothetical, I don't think they will, might decide to get off their bronzes and go and vote.
Well, I think so. There's a lot more interest in it now. I think the implications of it are coming through, that England's going to be a much poorer country for it because they'll lose industry and not be able to replace it. Yeah. And that's the key problem. And when you've got a whole 290 million people just on your doorstep, why do you have to turn your back on it?
It's ridiculous. It's insane, as you said it.
So we'll move on to this topic here is a little bit of an outside the financial planning side, but it was important to understand the change in women in the workforce over the last 30, 40 years, because women are now a major part of our workforce, and they are wealth creators in the sense that if we didn't have women in our workforce, we'd lose half our workforce effectively. But I wanted to look at the evolution of that because it's important to see how that role has changed over the last 500 years, and so significantly, because men's roles have been, in the workforce in many ways, but the way women have now integrated in the workforce is very new, and to look at that is quite interesting. So we're going to go a bit of a historical journey, but the key thing that we're looking at is how women are now nearly half the workforce. Obviously they're involved more in child rearing, but they still account for 25% of the full-time workers and 21% of the part-time workers, and 59% of women are in the workforce, the adult workforce. So they're a very major part of our economy. They create a lot of wealth through all sorts of occupations, but they've gone from being basic chattels in society to a very important part of our society. So I'm just going to go a bit of history there and let's look at how the importance of women has changed. So the first thing is that women used to be property of their fathers and husbands, and it seems a bit odd today, but it was major importance in the way you could operate as a woman, because I don't know if you remember the Downton Abbey when one of the daughters took over a magazine, and we think nothing of it today, but because the husband went off and died in Germany somewhere. But for a woman to take over a magazine was a big thing, because she didn't have access to a bank account. She didn't have access to a lot of the legal rights to do things because she didn't have those rights.